Adolf Hitler murdered 11 million people. Benito Mussolini murdered over 300,000 people. Joseph Stalin murdered 20 million people. It is generally accepted that these people have committed grave crimes against humanity during the course of World War II. What most people do not realize is that Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States of America during World War II, and his successor, Harry Truman, collectively murdered 700,000 people. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, murdered 305,000 people. Though for the most part these unforgivable crimes go unnoticed, they deserve just as much scrutiny and judgment as the merciless dictators who ruthlessly steamrolled over innocent civilians on their paths to world domination. Beginning in 1942, due to paranoia and suspicion rooted in racism which escalated from the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese Americans were thought of as terrorists that would help Japan bring down America from the inside. In response to the widespread unease, the U.S. government began rounding up anyone of Japanese descent, forced them out of their homes and into internment camps. Over 120,000 people were interned, and approximately 62% of them were American citizens. In these camps, people suffered inadequate housing and other facilities and the indignities of being imprisoned for no other reason than their race. There were also many people who died from inadequate medical care or being shot by guards for resisting orders. After the war, principles were developed to try people for war crimes, and many people were convicted on the basis of these principles. All the people convicted of war crimes were part of the Axis powers. According to Nuremberg Principle Number 6, a crime against humanity includes offenses in that they constitute a serious attack on human dignity or grave humiliation or degradation of one or more human beings. This includes political, racial, and religious persecution and other inhumane acts that are part of a widespread or systematic practice. Because these principles were constructed by the Allies after the war, it seems extremely hypocritical that the Americans would momentarily forget that they took the initiative to track down anyone who was even 1/16th Japanese and force them into internment camps. This is obviously systematic racial persecution that would constitute a serious attack on human dignity. In this effect, according to the Nuremberg principles that were used at military tribunals for war crimes, it would seem that Franklin Roosevelt is indeed a war criminal. One of the most memorable events of World War II was the Blitz of London, which occurred between September 7, 1940 and May 10, 1941. The Blitz was the continuous strategic bombing of London and other British cities by the German Luftwaffe. The other half of the story that has been largely obscured in shadows is that the British also employed devastating strategic bombing against Germany, and the Blitz was simply Germany's response. Beginning in July 1940, British bombs rained down upon German cities and towns. Although most of the targets had military association, many times pilots ended up missing their targets completely, resulting in the total destruction of innocent towns. It is not considered a war crime to attempt to bomb a military-affiliated target and miss, which is what Britain did at the beginning of the war. However, it is considered a war crime to intentionally bomb undefended towns and civilian populations, which Churchill permitted and even encouraged later in the war. In 1943, the British and Americans combined forces and firebombed the city of Hamburg. 50,000 civilians were killed. In 1945, they did the same to the city of Dresden, where 40,000 civilians were killed. Other German cities were targeted in the same manner. Altogether, more than 500,000 people were killed in the strategic bombing of German cities. Considering that intentional bombing of undefended citizens is a war crime, Churchill is unquestionably guilty. In addition to strategic bombing by Britain and America and Germany, the United States targeted Japan with the same tactics. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States relentlessly firebombed 67 Japanese cities, resulting in the deaths of 500,000 people. It got to the point where one city, Toyama, was 99% destroyed. These bombings clearly show no restraint or respect for the innocent civilians of Japan. As in the strategic bombing of Germany by Churchill, Roosevelt is equally as guilty of committing a crime against humanity. Two of the most infamous days in the history of the world were August 6th and August 9th of 1945. On those 2 days, the United States Air Force, commanded by President Harry Truman, dropped 2 bombs that the world had never seen the likes of before on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 2 cities in Japan. Within 4 months of this devastation, 200,000 people were dead. This does not include the people who died later from health defects due to radiation from the bombs. The majority of people killed on those 2 days were innocent civilians. According to the Hague Treaty, which is considered international law, the attack or bombardment by whatever means of towns, villages, dwellings, or buildings which are undefended is prohibited. Also, bombardment is legitimate only when directed exclusively at the following objectives, which are all militarily related. Obviously, the 200,000 innocent people were not defended, as many of them were simply carrying out their daily activities. In addition, although parts of Hiroshima at least had some military importance, the bomb was directed at the city in its entirety, not just the military portion. While this atrocity is in no way morally acceptable, it is also important to recognize that it was the worst decision, except for all the rest, by the United States government. However, these 2 bombs still clearly violate the Hague Treaty, therefore violate international law, therefore violate the Nuremberg Principles, therefore Harry Truman is a war criminal. Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Harry Truman, if tried by the principles of international law, would have no reprieve and would have been found just as guilty as those they tried for war crimes after the war. They bombed mercilessly, stripped American citizens of their rights, freedom, and dignity, and showed callous indifference towards the value of human life. The only reason they were not punished for their crimes is that they were the victors of the brutal war. If the tables had been turned, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Truman would surely have been convicted, just as they convicted their enemies. No one is saying that those who were convicted of war crimes are not criminals. A majority of them were simply pure evil. However, if the trials had been judged by impartial outsiders who considered all countries' actions, not just the losing side, the 3 heroes of the war would have spent the remainder of their lives viewing the world they once ruled from behind bars.